Okay, welcome to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. We'll continue our series on the French Revolution and the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte. And today is the most interesting and most fascinating part, and that's his defeat. So the title is the Russian Campaign and the Disaster or Collapse, or the end of Napoleon's rule and career. So let's talk about the causes of this disaster, and that's the political situation in 1812. And that is basically when Napoleon is already several years the total master of Europe, and nothing seems to be particularly wrong on the horizon, except that one day he gets the news that Alexander the First of Russia no longer will abide by the rules of the Continental System, which bans trade with Britain. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think that Alexander cared at all, a bit, about trade. This was probably the least thing he knew anything about. But this was a way for him to defy Napoleon. So in many ways, it's a kind of a personal animosity that Alexander kept in regard to Napoleon after his absolute devastating defeat in Austerlitz and the humiliation when he actually ran from the battlefield. A humiliation actually that was in front of the Russian troops and generals, and he was very shaken up by this. So my view is that it's really a personal, the causes of the war are not societal, they're not political, they're not economic, it's personal. It's a personal desire of Alexander to get back at Napoleon if he has a chance. Now the question, of course, is why didn't he do it in 1808 when they made in Tilsit? In Tilsit, he was right after Russian army was defeated and the Prussian army was defeated. And if he had refused to abide at that time, probably Napoleon would have marched to St. Petersburg, which was 400 kilometers away. So he agreed to a compromise, even though he resented it. In any case, this is the reason. Now, Napoleon cannot be challenged, and so it's almost like an automatic reaction. You challenge Napoleon, he goes to war. So in that sense, it's also not very smart. In other words, when a leader is predictable, the reason Napoleon won all the time is because he was unpredictable. This time, he is predictable. You challenge him, he's going to go to war. So in a sense, one could predict that now that Alexander challenged him, he's going to go to war. Was there other ways of punishing Alexander? I don't know. Perhaps there was. One could have thought of a punitive expedition. One could have thought of other ways. But Napoleon decides to punish him real big. And he assembles what is known in history as La Grande Armée, which is 600,000 men in one place at one time. And that, for your record, this is the biggest army ever assembled at that time. There was never a place in human history that there was a bigger army assembled in one place at one time. 600,000, more than 500,000 troops. So he assembles that army with a desire to go and teach Alexander a lesson that he wouldn't forget. Now another problem was with the Grande Armée was that Napoleon didn't plan this campaign very well. I mean, as you know, he did plan a lot of things really well, but this one he didn't. And I'm saying it because I really studied it. I studied every day of the campaign and how it developed. I read documents, I read correspondence. As soon as he crossed the NIEMAN River and started moving into Russian territory, there were complaints about supplies, and that they were running out of supplies. Look, 600,000 men have to be provided for with food, and they would carry all their guns and ammunition and be ready for fighting. So it's a pretty big undertaking. Now he didn't have the supply lines secure, and so they had to provision, as it was called, from the local population. which is standard practice. He was not the only army that did that. But again, that actually, when the army of that size takes food from the local population, you can imagine this local population is not going to be loving that army very much because they take away their food. So that means that he pretty much was, you know, antagonizing the Russian population, and that didn't help. Moreover, the Russians now began to practice scorched earth policy, which means that before Napoleon, they would burn the villages, depopulate them, make people retreat. In other words, this was already not the kind of war that Napoleon was used to. Napoleon was used to the war that you come, you win, and you sign peace. I ain't gonna be that way this way now. Nobody's in a hurry to sign anything, and moreover, they're not fighting the war by the rules. That's what is Napoleon's major complaint. They're not gentlemen. They're not fighting an honest fight. Uh, Nobody would destroy villages in Germany or in Bavaria when Napoleon's army approached. So then he does make what I believe, when I thought a lot about that war, one big mistake. So the army is getting deeper into Russia and it is retreating. So Napoleon has to make a choice. How far are we going to pursue them? Because every 100 kilometers away from the border is one more 100 kilometers to supply lines that you have to be capable to sustain your army. And then if you do go deeper into Russia, what do? Do you pursue the army wherever it goes? So that means you're not in control of the situation. Or do you have your own strategic objective? And then you fulfill that objective. My view is that he should have gone against St. Petersburg, regardless of whether the Russian army goes. And if the Russian army would prefer to abandon St. Petersburg, that's their choice. If they would prefer to defend St. Petersburg, then they would go where Napoleon wants to go. Why St. Petersburg rather than Moscow? Simply because St. Petersburg is on the water, and other than 2 months in the year, it could be supplied by the sea. Second of all, because it's only 350 kilometers from Estonia, which means friendly territory. 300 kilometers is much easier to cover than 1,000 kilometers. For your information, the Polish border is exactly 1,000 kilometers from Moscow. I traveled that distance several times. So he did not choose correctly. He chose to pursue the Russian army and to destroy it, which meant that they kept running and he kept running after them. You know, one could put it this way: the Russians lured him deeper and deeper into Russia, which turned out to be a disaster for him. In any case, so the campaign starts again quite late. It's June, and it would be all over by November. He should have started it earlier. She should have started it at least in April so that he would have a whole season of warm temperatures to conduct the campaign. In any case, by September, September 7th exactly, is the crucial date where he does do battle. And this is called, every Russian child knows this, it's called the Battle of Borodino, which is a field, today a museum with all kinds of expositions of this huge battle, which was one of the biggest battles ever held by that time. Uh, so the Battle of Borodino, basically one could say Napoleon won, in the sense that the Russians had higher casualties and that they retreated. So by any normal standards of military tactics, the army that runs from the battlefield is called the defeated army. And they did, so I think that one should appreciate the extent of Napoleon's capabilities, because he's 800, almost 900 kilometers from the Russian border. He has brought with him guns and weapons and cannons and rifles. He has a capable army, and that far from friendly territory. He does battle and he wins in the sense that it crushes the opponent's army and they have to retreat. So that's a great achievement. One could put it this way. Napoleon won the battle. But, as it will turn out, he lost the war. So after Borodino, the Russians retreat, and the road to Moscow is open. It's only 30 or 40 kilometers to Moscow. So he goes to Moscow. Again, the Russians do something totally unthinkable in West European terms. They burn Moscow. They literally burn Moscow, destroy it completely. And at that time, Moscow was not like a West European city, which is mostly stone. St. Petersburg was made of stone, as of Peter the Great's orders. All buildings in St. Petersburg had to be made of stone. But Moscow was wooden. A lot of it was wood. There were stone buildings, especially the Kremlin and the churches and the government buildings, but a lot of living neighborhoods were made of wood. And so they burnt it all. And the population was ordered to retreat. So when Napoleon enters Moscow, he thought that he's going to see, the mayor of the city that would come with the keys, ceremonies that he had seen many, many times in Europe, in Western Europe. Now he basically gets into smoldering fire and no provisions, no population, and essentially destroyed city that he enters in September. So he's sitting there in the Kremlin, waiting for a response to his letter to Alexander to conclude peace. Now, from Napoleon's point of view, he won. He defeated the Russian army and he took Moscow, one of the two capitals. So the next thing that should happen by Napoleon's reasoning is that Alexander should come pleading to sign peace. That's what Napoleon is used to. Hey, no response is coming. There's no response coming. And his casualties are pretty heavy. And he can't really tender to the wounded ones. And the supply lines are non-existent. There is none. So he's absolutely in an untenable situation. He cannot remain in Moscow for the winter because that would be a total disaster. So in November, he gives up and he begins a retreat back to Europe. And the Russians harass him, and so he has to take the same road back. It's called the Smolensk road as the one he took in the beginning, which is bad because this is already a devastated area. If he had taken a different road, he could have come at least to some areas that had not been touched by war, which means have more food and stuff. But the Russians wouldn't let him. They harass him, which is another thing that never happened in Europe. The kind of partisan detachments that kind of harass and attack and ambush the French without any normal procedures of war. They just descend upon them and start killing the French soldiers out of nowhere. A kind of partisan warfare that just wasn't practiced at that time. The only place it was practiced was in Spain, where also Napoleon had a very hard time because of popular resistance and because of the detachments that the British financed, and they really killed a lot of French and made the French occupation of Spain very, very costly. So in any case, by November, 200,000 crossed the border, the Polish border. So out of 600,000, it's 200,000 that make it back. Now, I forgot to mention that of the 600,000, only 200,000 are French. All the others are foreigners. But the largest foreign contingent are the Poles. The Poles hate the Russians and they would absolutely love to fight against the Russians with the French army. So there were about close to 200,000 Poles. And the other 200,000 were various German states that were affiliated with Napoleon. So the Rhine Confederation armies, they contributed a little bit here, a little bit there, but it came up to be a serious 200,000. Now these troops, of course, were totally unreliable, and they were probably the first ones to defect or to change their sides or whatever. In any case, the bulk of his army is lost, but the French corps is actually there, and they do come back. Uh, he actually, as soon as he crosses the border, he sort of leaves them there to move on their own, and then hurries on to Paris to build a new army. A funny story that I have to tell you. There's a word in Russian which is called sharamizhnik, and when you examine the etymology of the word, it comes from the French chercher manger, and sharamizhnik is a person who goes around and asks for food. It's a vagabond in today's Russian, sharamizhnik. Well, the origin is that there were these French soldiers going around in the countryside and saying cherchez manger, and that's the origin of the word. And one other interesting story, one time I saw a documentary that shows a Belarusian village, and next to it is a sign that says Paris, 3 kilometers. And then another sign that says Fontainebleau in Russian letters, 5 kilometers. So then there was historical research done, and it turned out to be that these are the villages where French soldiers stayed and married Russian women and gave titles, names to these villages, which were Paris, Fontainebleau, and a few other ones, who basically stayed in Russia after that campaign. Anyway, we'll stop at that, and then we'll continue after a pause. Don't forget to subscribe to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin.